Good Monday morning, and thanks for listening to my musing today, which is about ignorance. And hopefully I'm not spreading it today. There's a wonderful passage, and since this is around Advent, it speaks to the life of Jesus in Luke 2, verse 52, where we read that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and others. I think it's important that we remember even Christ grew. It's not the case that as an infant he was omnipotent, omniscient. At no point is he omnipresent. So how do we understand for the historical Jesus what it means to grow? Growing from childhood into maturity. If even Jesus has to grow in wisdom and in stature, what does that say about our growth? I find it incredibly helpful to think about ignorance in two ways: a first ignorance and a second ignorance. A first ignorance is something that you can't really do that much about. Have you ever been singing a song in the car with someone and they turn at you and look at you funny because you've been singing the lyrics wrong for years? That's a first ignorance. There's no reason for you to know that the words were different than what you sang all along. In all sorts of ways, there are things that we don't know, and it's understandable that we ourselves are not omniscient. We are not all-knowing. So that ignorance needs a kindness that goes along with us. We should not blame ourselves. Hopefully others don't blame us for what we do not know, because we come from a place of unknowing. The second ignorance is something that we should be awfully careful about. When we hear new information, when we have opportunities for learning, and there is something within us, whether that's confirmation bias or it's the stubbornness that we have, that says, I somehow, some way, consciously or subconsciously, refuse to know and observe the facts as they are being presented to me. For the entire time that we've been in COVID, there have been three things that have remained as important to know. That we need to keep our social distance, we need to wash our hands, and we need to wear our masks. Yet somehow, those three things combat a second ignorance where arguments about freedom, arguments about the role of government come to play over and against these three things that we know are helpful in combating the spread of the virus. That's one very clear and present example where there is something like a willful ignorance, what I call a second ignorance, that we need to combat. For people in the church, for matters spiritual and otherwise, how do we help to address a first ignorance? How do we spread the love and the grace of God, the good news that God is for us, not against us, because God loves us? If it's somehow the case that people don't know that that's what the church stands for, it's our duty to dispel that first ignorance. And it's also important for us to look at our own second ignorances, the things that we refuse to know, the things that are hard to know, and think about how we come to grips with them. And I have a couple of examples, if you can stick around a little longer to listen, for how we might do just that. There's a passage in the book of Hebrews, chapter 5, verse 2. In Hebrews 5, the writer is talking about a high priest who, even for himself, must make atoning sacrifices. It says that even a high priest makes mistakes and is ignorant of some things. So in verse 2, it says that Jesus, ultimately, is kind towards our unknowing, kind and gentle towards our ignorance. And again, I think that speaks to a first ignorance primarily. Jesus is kind maybe to our second ignorances too. But the point is, where we find ourselves lacking knowledge, lacking wisdom, how are we supposed to form ourselves and prepare ourselves for humility that embraces what we don't know, and do the things, the hard work that it takes to dispel that ignorance? I remember that I was interviewing for a job. It was a simple Sunday where the pastor had invited me to just observe the service. I didn't need to meet anybody. I just wanted to take in worship. That was the pastor's hope for me, to see if that was a place where I would like to work. I'd come from a Baptist background, which I've talked about before, and I was in a Presbyterian church. There was a confession, which I had done before, and then everyone stood up and started singing the Gloria Patri. For my Southern Baptist ears, singing a song with a title in Latin without anyone taking a hymn made me feel pretty uncomfortable. It was something I had never done before. I didn't know the words. I didn't know where to find the words. And by the time I started fumbling around with my hymnal, the song was over and everyone sat back down. I might have been the last person standing in the sanctuary. I felt really embarrassed about myself. I felt really out of place based on this first ignorance, the first encounter with something new. And I think that as much as I wanted to cover that ignorance up, for a place like a church, in that example, it was incredibly helpful when someone tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You must be new here, and I'm so glad that you came." I could have heard jeers. I could have seen people looking embarrassed for me, but that wasn't the case. That people understood if you want new people in a congregation, they might not be accustomed to all of the ways that the church works. Being able to comfort people, to know what it's like to be embarrassed by our first ignorances, is a wonderful gift that people are able to give to one another. And it means that the snap judgments we make about people, why are they so ignorant? How could they be so, this is my least favorite word, stupid, when there's nothing in a person's experience that would help them to know what you know? How would they know unless you told them? How do people understand the ways you think, the ways you feel, the ways you process information, unless you move past the barriers of ignorance to enter into a kind of helpful relationship where you share in knowledge? You have the opportunity to do that all the time, but it doesn't come without pain. The embarrassment of when you're waving and you realize that someone is waving at the person behind you, that is not a good feeling. Everyone experiences it. You feel like a doofus. I don't like the word dumb or stupid. Doofus is a great word. How do we understand those feelings in ourselves and in others so that those initial feelings in a first ignorance, when we first hear new information, those feelings are growing pains? I like to think about knowledge as a small circle, and we stand in the middle of it. And everything we've ever learned stands in that circle with us. For us to expand our knowledge, we have to push against the walls of our knowledge and our realms of experience to start including other things in that circle. So when we read that Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor, we are talking about an adolescent Jesus, one who felt real physical growing pains. So I wonder how that's analogous to our knowledge growth, our wisdom growth, our spiritual growth. Can we learn to be accustomed to that pain and discomfort, knowing that something good and something growing comes from it? I think that dispels and hopefully says a little bit about how we address one another in our first ignorance. But what about that other kind of ignorance? Willful ignorance. The kinds where people refuse to listen to others, refuse to grow, refuse to know different things. Now, of course, I hope you are becoming aware of your second ignorances, and I, the expert, could tell you all about it. But that's not normally the way things work. When we feel embarrassed, when we feel we don't know, when we're presented with new facts, we become defensive, closed off. Those terrible feelings that we have of embarrassment or feeling like a doofus in the first experiences, Those are the same feelings that keep us from wanting to grow in a second experience. I think everyone can learn a lot if we're willing to recognize that our feeling offended, our feeling uncomfortable, is a feeling of growth. And we can flex those muscles. We can become accustomed, just like someone in a new yoga class and then in a 10th yoga class. Certain things start to feel normal. Certain things start to feel easier if we can limber up to those feelings where sometimes everyone says offensive things. We are in conversations where other people say things that offend us. And those initial feelings like we are ignorant or other people are ignorant, need to be first steps, not last steps in a conversation. So that in our growth, we include in our circle that is expanding those that we encounter. So that we're growing together. We help dispel ignorance first by understanding it, naming it, observing it, and seeking to help one another grow. So for you, how can you have a difficult conversation? How can you put yourself in a place where you don't know very much? You feel uncomfortable. When we're able to meet together, maybe that's something as easy as a cooking class or taking up a new sport or a new hobby. Those things flex those same muscles as hard conversations do. I hope you find ways, again, to dispel the ignorance, because there are so many wonderful things in the world that we can know, do, and experience. And maybe by working on those first things, those first new things, and being open to new ideas, that helps us with those second things, where we learn there are a lot of people with a lot of opinions. And it's beautiful and wonderful if we can get past our first discomfort to get to know them and what they think, what they feel. That's the invitation. I hope you're able to do that this week. Thanks for listening to my musing. I'll see you next Monday.